If you're new to woodworking, you might be intimidated by all of the paraphernalia available in the world of sharpening. In fact, let me show you something. This is my sharpening drawer. As you can see, I'm part of the problem. But the good news is there is a reliable way to sharpen that's cheap and easy. And it's a method known as Steady Sharp. To get started, we'll need a flat surface. I'm using glass, but you can use something else as long as it's fairly flat. We'll also need some wet-dry sandpaper, tape, water, and an optional honing guide. For the sandpaper, I'm going with 320 and 1000 grit. You can add a grit between those two if you want to, or even go higher than 1000, but I'm going to show you that you can get a decent result even when you stop at 1000. Most new chisels have obvious grinding marks from the manufacturer, so we'll use those to track our flattening progress. With the sandpaper taped down to the glass, I spray the surface with some water and begin moving the chisel forward and back while applying downward pressure. After just a few passes on a 320 grit, you should be able to see where the sandpaper did its job. Even though the chisel is several inches long, you don't need to flatten the whole thing. For most uses, you really only need about the first inch or so to be flat, so I'll completely ignore the rest of the chisel back. Now, you're going to want to check your progress periodically, and what you're really looking for is a nice even scratch pattern that erases all the grinding marks. So if you're not there yet, keep going. It might be necessary to drop down to a coarser grit and then work your way back up. At this point, I can still see some grinding marks in one small area, but most of that bottom inch is flat, so I think we're going to roll with it. Let's jump up to 1000 grit. Before I do though, I'll rinse the chisel with water to remove any low grit residue that might contaminate our higher grit surface. Continue working the back of the chisel until the new finer scratch pattern replaces the old one. You should start to see at least some sheen and polish developing. Most sharpening videos only give you a close-up, so you don't get to see the proper body posture that's required. This is what you're going for. And that's looking pretty darn good. So now that the back is fairly flat and polished, we need to sharpen the bevel, and I need some markers. So what's actually happening on the chisel is we have our bevel here, then we have the back, and here's the top of the chisel. And the sharp edge is really a product of two clean, flat planes coming together to make this point. That's where all the cutting happens. So when we work on the bevel, we could actually sharpen this entire thing, but thankfully we don't have to. You could take a bit of a shortcut here. So instead of sharpening that whole entire thing, we're going to add what's called a secondary bevel. This is very exaggerated, but it's at a steeper angle. That secondary bevel is really all that matters, because as long as this becomes a nice flat plane that meets this flat plane, you're going to get that sharp edge, and we can actually ignore the rest of this bevel. To make the secondary bevel, we only need to raise the chisel up a couple of degrees from the primary bevel, and I find it easiest to do this using an inexpensive honing guide. I'll just eyeball the setting on this one, but ideally you want to make up a setup board that allows you to accurately return the chisel to any angle or micro-bevel that you want, simply by extending it a particular length from the front of the guide. I'll work the bevel on the 320 grit by pulling back toward me. You can go back and forth, but there's a good chance you'll rip the paper, so just be careful. Here you can see the secondary bevel is starting to form at the tip, and I can also feel a burr developing on the back. This is just excess metal that's been pushed out over the tip of the chisel, and it's a good sign because it means that our two planes are forming a nice sharp edge. And we can quickly get rid of it by lapping the back on our highest grit a few times. It's a good idea once again to rinse the chisel and the guide before going to the higher grit. Now repeat on 1000 grit. Now there are lots of people who prefer to sharpen freehand, and it's a great skill to have, but personally I prefer to use a guide whenever possible for the sake of accuracy, control, and less stress on my hands. And again, feel for the burr, and then remove it. You can repeat this cycle once or twice just to make sure that the bevel is as clean and refined as possible. And believe it or not, the chisel is now perfectly serviceable. A good way to test for sharpness is to take your fingernail and drag it across the blade. If you make keratin dust, you've got a sharp blade there. Some people like to shave their arm, and I've done that before, but I've since decided that it makes a lot more sense to judge performance by how well it cuts wood, not body hair. And that, my friends, is what I call sharp enough to get some work done. Now, if you want an even sharper and more durable edge, you certainly could explore other options like different sharpening mediums, higher grit sandpaper, and even honing compounds that can give you a mirror polish on here. But the point of this is that you don't have to do that. You can get a perfectly serviceable chisel just the way that I showed you here. Now, one potential downside of this method is the fact that you have to keep buying sandpaper. So in the long run, it may actually turn out to be more expensive if you're, let's say, a pro and you sharpen a lot. So if you get a stone, that's something that might last a hobbyist multiple generations, right? But if you are only sharpening maybe a couple times a year, this could then be the cheaper option. And finally, just a general bit of advice here. Pick a sharpening system and stick with it. The worst thing you can do is try every different one and never really get good at any of them. All of them will work, all of them will produce an edge that cuts wood, right? So get good at one and don't worry about how you got there, just worry about the quality of the edge and your ability to tell sharp from dull. All right, so thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time. You can try, very sharp.